This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good evening. China's old-line communist leaders tried again today to convince the world that they have total control and have the country unified. 84-year-old headman Deng Xiaoping appeared in public for the first time in weeks. Tanks and troops made new shows of force in new areas of Beijing. Police, both uniformed and plainclothes, flooded streets and neighborhoods. Reports of secret terror and arrests abound. Nearly everyone connected to the pro-freedom movement was on the run and hunted. CBS News China correspondent John Sheehan has our first report.
Thousands of troops have moved to staging areas close to the university quarter, apparently poised to fulfill a martial law order to put the campuses under military control. But overall, the siege of Beijing is moving from the military to the political, the first wave of arrests.
It's very difficult in a totalitarian state to hide. There are a lot of instruments of authority available to the security forces.
Supreme Leader Deng Xiaoping, rumored dead a few days ago, reappeared for the first time in 3 weeks and took responsibility for the crackdown that resulted in the massacre of hundreds, if not thousands, of peaceful protesters. Communist authorities have called on the survivors to give themselves up to the police.
They will use photographs that have been taken during the course of the demonstrations, probably to include even those photographs that were used by the media services here in the United States.
Deng praised the brutal suppression of the students and led a silent tribute to soldiers who died during the night of military terror. Deng's appearance is the sign the Chinese public has been waiting for, that there is an intact power structure. Deng attempted to justify the violence by saying that the protesters were attempting to overthrow the communist system and turn China into a capitalist country. The United States and other countries evacuated more of their citizens today because of the potential for continued upheaval.
I'm too old to be doing this. Get back home.
Tomorrow, embassy officers who have been working around the clock plan to cross the military lines to rescue anxious Americans stranded in Tianjin, 150 miles away. There is no rescue for pro-democracy students now on the run from Chinese police. John Sheehan, CBS News, Beijing.
The heart of China was a garrison today. In Tiananmen Square, the authorities staged a pageant of victory, a coronation ceremony for the old guard, which had waged war against a new generation and had won. There was martial music and military precision, a smart and sharp contrast to the sweet disorder of the democracy movement, which had dominated the square until Saturday night. The rest of Beijing was coming back to life in a sullen sort of way. The rest of Beijing, that is, except for the campuses, which were desolate places. At Beijing University, the heart of the rebellion, dormitories were deserted, classrooms empty, sports fields abandoned.
Students say the army swept through the campus for the first time last night and talked to the administration, wanted to know who belonged to the student union, which has been declared an illegal organization. The president of the university this morning told all the students to leave the campus and go home for their own safety.
In fact, the exodus had already begun. Students, by definition now marked men, trying to fade away into the vastness of China.
Most of the people think the Army's going to come any minute, take students away, maybe the professors away, people that were involved in the protest.
Some American exchange students came by to look for their Chinese friends, found a few, just a few.
Most of them have gone back home, back to their towns. They've just gotten on trains and gotten out of here. They were really scared, so for good reason.
The only life on campus was by the memorial boards, where lists were updated of the dead and the missing, where mourning was a residual act of rebellion, with the government still insisting that no students had died in the square. Meet blood with blood, read one poster. No one on earth has ever been so cruel, read another. There was lingering horror and disbelief.
I was very sad about that, and fears. Everyone has fears about that, so I'm not sure. No. I don't want it happen again.
There are no safe places anymore. All over China, faces in a crowd were spotted by soldiers and taken away. The roundup had begun. In Chengdu, Sichuan province, 100 people arrested, the authorities say, for vandalizing vehicles. Young people. In the industrial city of Wuhan, more young people, a gang of hooligans, according to the authorities. Everywhere tonight, it seems that the best and the brightest are behind bars or on the run. By Beijing Science University, a banner reads, "The mountains are crying for the loss of our youth. It is a generation with hate in its heart, which will surface again one day. But for now, for this month of June, this is the class of '89. Bob Simon, CBS News, Beijing.
There are some signs that the center of gravity for the pro-democracy movement may be shifting to Shanghai, China's largest city. There was another huge protest march there today. For reasons that are unclear, Communist Party leaders did not or could not stop it. Shanghai demonstrators, led by students, are making stiff demands. How long they will be allowed to make them unchallenged is a question mark. Jerry Bowen is our man in Shanghai.
In Beijing, students have been killed for this. In the port city of Shanghai today, where there's no martial law, city officials let them march, let them publicly mourn the dead of Tiananmen Square, the students killed in the massacre that Beijing now insists never took place. Tens of thousands of students and some workers began their protest in Shanghai's People's Square, marched in with banners and flags and wreaths, the largest anti-government demonstration in China since the carnage in Beijing. But it's a march to the beat of a tired drummer. The students have ended their street barricades here. Some of their leaders have been arrested. Worker support has weakened, and there's desperation mixed with the defiance as the students speak of their hopes for democracy, their hopes for freedom.
We are sure that we will win a final victory, although it may mean that we will have to fight for some long time and we may lose some more lives.
Today, it was government surveillance of the people as the students made new demands, called for a dialogue, for Shanghai television to show the killing that took place in Beijing, for city flags to be lowered to half-staff to honor the dead.
The students have given the Shanghai government 48 hours to respond to their demands, or else. The or else was left vague, but one can only imagine the reaction of a government used to delivering its own ultimatums.
Shanghai's mayor said only last night he doesn't want to call on the army, doesn't want martial law. What he may have been saying was, learn from the lesson of Tiananmen Square. So the police today just stood by and watched as the students marched into the heart of Shanghai, on by City Hall, toward a self-imposed deadline, perhaps toward a new confrontation. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Shanghai.
President Bush, through spokesman, today condemned the Beijing massacre. But the president is sticking with the policy of trying not to be what he considers too critical of China's communist leadership. More about that from White House correspondent Leslie Stahl. Leslie?
Dan, the president's press secretary was harsher in his denunciations today than the president was last night. Said the press secretary, the government has murdered many of its own people. Reprisals against the students are repugnant. We watch this with grave concern. And yet, despite the TV pictures today of Deng Xiaoping in effect taking credit for the crackdown, Mr. Bush still won't make judgments about Deng and is still waiting for him to return the phone call Mr. Bush placed to him yesterday. It's been hard for those involved in the plotting, step-by-step, 17-year climb to a good relationship to see it disintegrate so rapidly. Going back to Richard Nixon's breakthrough meeting with Mao Zedong, every president has kept the momentum going.
The progress has been fantastic from '72 up until several weeks ago. I am saddened to see this rupture take place, and I hope it's temporary.
So does President Bush, who was envoy to China in the Ford years. He celebrated the stability of the relationship with a walk through Tiananmen Square 3 months before the massacre there.
What I want to do is preserve this relationship as best I can, and I hope the conditions that lie ahead will permit me to preserve this relationship.
This is an enormous setback for Sino-American relations.
Many of the old China hands question whether the relationship can be preserved.
This entire fabric of bilateral relations has clearly been jeopardized, perhaps even damaged very seriously by the events of the last few weeks.
Officials here say that neither trade sanctions nor economic reprisals can have any effect in the short term on Chinese behavior, so Mr. Bush sees no point in moving fast. He also believes that any split with China can only benefit the Soviet Union. Dan?
Leslie Stahl, thanks. There was a big rally supporting China's freedom movement at the United Nations today. New York's Democratic Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan urged support for President Bush's policy, the policy of not being too critical of Chinese communist leaders. Moynihan was booed off the stage. CBS News reporter Aaron Hayes has more on the demonstrations here in New York and other U.S. cities.
Nearly 20,000 Chinese Americans marched in a downpour through the streets of New York's Chinatown, denouncing Li Peng and Deng Xiaoping as murderers.
Stop the killing! Stop the killing!
At the United Nations, New York's Mayor Koch said President Bush should give asylum to Chinese student leaders in Beijing and make a personal appearance before the UN Security Council.
And he should turn to the ambassador of the People's Republic and he should say, shame, shame, shame!
This wasn't happening just in New York. Chinese Americans demonstrated in solidarity with their countrymen in cities throughout the U.S. today. In Los Angeles, hundreds protested at UCLA. In Chicago, as church bells tolled, demonstrators wept.
There were so many times I wish I were blind so that I didn't have to see the blood of Chinese people dripping off the pages of newspapers.
Last Saturday, the symbol of the student protest was crushed in Beijing. But late today, a new goddess of democracy was brought to the Chinese consulate in New York. Its student sculptors hope the goddess will one day stand in victory in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Aaron Hayes, CBS News, New York.
And still to come on the CBS Evening News, Bruce Hall on keeping the kids in school by taking them out of the driver's seat. And Ray Brady on tomorrow's big race, the run for glory and serious money.